Wait, and Derek walks in, and it was quiet, so I thought it was like.
I was even talking about you.
And then Derek's like. Oh, that's who it is. And then around the house.
All right. Whatever you're saying is going out to the whole cyber world. Let's settle in, get this done. This is actually, if you looked over to your right when you came in, there's a quiz on Tuesday, ladies and gentlemen. You gotta stop talking. There's a quiz on Tuesday covering just Truman and Eisenhower. That's kind of how we're gonna finish the year. Basically, 2 or 3 presidents at a time have a quiz, and literally, before we know it, the year's gonna be over. This is the last day of the third 9 weeks, and the fourth 9 weeks. The third 9 weeks were crazy because we had all the snow days. The fourth 9 weeks gonna be crazy because there's testing day. What's that? 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks from now, there's gonna be testing, the eye test. Week after that, we go to Easter break. We come back from that. We go to mini term. We come back from that. There's like prom and stuff. It's crazy. And then we're in the middle of March or May. It's gonna fly. We found out yesterday that almost everybody liked Ike. Eisenhower was a very popular political figure in both parties, actually, because he was a great war hero. And not just a war hero, but he was seen as a very competent administrator, executive. If he can run a war, and yes, you guys didn't get to this?
No.
Did you get to this?
Yeah, we just finished that.
Yeah.
Did we look at the election?
Yeah.
Okay. Did we say that he was the first Republican president
No.
since Herbert Hoover? Think about that. Hoover was elected in 1928, and then we know about the catastrophe that happened in October of 1929, only 9 months into his presidency. So FDR took over, was elected not once, not twice, not thrice, but 4 times. So he was followed by his vice president, Truman, who, against all odds, got elected again, right? So you had FDR 4 times. So even though it's been 24 years since a Republican was elected, it was really only 2 people, FDR and his vice president. So let's talk about Ike, his first term. He has, as his running mate, a senator from California. California continues to grow. Even though at this time there's not that many more people in California than Ohio, they are continuing to grow. So California is a very important state politically. So it makes sense to choose just to make sure. He's already very popular, but this has to be taken into consideration when you're choosing a running mate. Make sure we're going to get California. Richard Milhouse Nixon. Now, when we talk about Nixon in a few weeks, most of you, if you've heard of Richard Nixon, you've heard of him in a very negative light, and for good reason, because there's going to be a very scandalous thing that happens during his presidency called Watergate. How many have ever heard that word before? Okay, good. We will learn more about it. And what's interesting is, as we fast forward 50 years almost from Watergate, if Watergate was to happen today, it would be like a drop in the bucket compared to all of the political corruption and shenanigans that have taken place since then. In fact, very recently since then. So Watergate was a big deal. The actual crime that was committed at that hotel called Watergate wasn't the big deal. The big deal was that the president, the number one face of the nation, was trying to cover it up. Even though he wasn't guilty of actually doing it, he was trying to cover it up because how bad it made his campaign look. And now we live in an era where it's this constant political shenanigans and cover-ups. 1953, that would be the first year of his administration, right? So I put this in the notes, just trying to hit the highlights here. Why would that be in the notes? Because when we say the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare were created, what part of the Federalist system runs that Department of Health, Education, and Welfare? Is it the local government, the state government, or the national government? What part of? No, this is why this is significance. National. What changed in the 1930s? That one question on your test. What changed in the 1930s as far as the way people saw national government's role in the economy in general and their specific economic life? Go ahead.
I just want to be the best.
Oh, go ahead. Anybody? Come on. Yeah.
They allowed it more, they accepted it more.
Yeah. The sentiment in America was because of the Great Depression and the crisis that everybody was in, that the federal government should not only debating whether it was constitutional, is that the way the founding fathers wanted it? Well, you know what? Regardless, we are in a crisis, so they should. And that kind of changed the mentality, leading to something like this is just a continuation of that kind of mindset, where the federal government is becoming more and more significant in people's lives. Go back to 1850? No. States. What was the whole Civil War about? Slavery, right. What was the underlying theme of the Civil War besides everybody knows it was about slavery? Well, what about slavery? Yeah.
States could decide.
That the states had the right to decide whether to have slavery. Remember all the things leading up to that, this compromise, that compromise. Hey, the United States was built as the United States. Every state government is sovereign unto itself, and it gets to determine with its own constitution what is right for that state. So there's this constant battle about slavery because some states, the people there that were settling didn't want slavery. Other states, they wanted to continue the idea of slavery. Not the moral issue, which we know is all wrong and awful, but legally, what was the issue? According to our Constitution, anything that's not specifically outlined in the Constitution as the responsibility of the federal government goes to the states. It's the 10th Amendment. Not only in the Constitution, the idea of the federalist kind of government where local government is most important, state government, and then federal, and now we've turned it on its head. What's the most important? When you think of government, what do you think of? I guarantee you don't think of Lisbon or Youngstown or even Columbus. What do you think of? What city? Washington, D.C. Like government. Oh, yeah, Washington. That's not the way it was for most of our history, and it's not the way it was founded. But this is showing you that that's continuing. We are continuing to give that authority to the national government. How does that affect us today? As each generation gives more and more authority to the national government, we just went through 2 years where the national government decided, hey, you own that business? We're closing it. What do you mean? What do you mean? What? You're going to demand and mandate that I close my business? Evidently that was okay because another crisis entered the scene. The crisis of the pandemic, of the mild virus that really adversely affects people with pre-existing conditions and the elderly. But it was enough of a crisis that most people said, yep, government has the right to shut your business down so you don't spread it. Flatten the curve. Earl Warren, remember that guy? He was the vice presidential candidate of. We're really testing here. Really testing how much you've been paying attention before you even start studying for Tuesday's quiz. Earl Warren was the vice presidential candidate that was running along with this guy, who everybody thought was going to win because he was the governor of New York and Warren was the governor of California. And if you've got the East Coast and the West Coast, you got the governors of both of those big states. Nobody's caught my little purposeful foible there. The East Coast and the West Coast, if you got, I said left first. The East Coast and the West Coast, you got both you don't even understand why I said that, do you? You think it has to do with East is on my right and West is on my left, but it's a little political joke. The East Coast and the left Coast. Anybody else get it?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, California, which has become a very, 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 did I say very liberal state, right? So if you have both of those governors, oh, and by the way, what was going on with Democrats? They were in disarray, remember that? So Warren was the running mate of, who's answering the question? It was that famous election. Somebody back there? You can all say it. Thomas Dewey, right? Tom Dewey, who somehow lost. All the odds were against Truman. Here's a famous speech delivered by President Eisenhower in 1953 in his first year of his presidency. He is a war hero, a war that ended with the use of the atomic bomb, a war that ended with absolute, utter destruction of 2 cities in Japan by using atomic energy, by using fission to split the atoms and create an incredible amount of energy, enough to destroy, vaporize people upon detonation. And he goes before the United States people and the world and says, hey, we can use this energy, this incredible way we've learned to harness fission, atomic energy. That doesn't have to be used for destruction. That could be used for clean energy. That could be used for peaceful purposes. What we learned, unfortunately, it was used for the destruction, but what we learned in all of these tests and experiments we've done with atomic experimentalism, we can use that for peaceful means. We can provide clean, efficient, cheap energy for all the world. We can light up cities. We think about it today. What's driving our policies today? This is a fact, whether you agree with it or not. What's driving our policies is what used to be called global warming, the climate change, right? I mean, we're basing, some people go so far as to say that what's going on in Ukraine is because the United States being so adamant about not using fossil fuels because of their belief in man-made global warming, climate change, that we're no longer energy independent. Russia has gotten this power as the oil exporter, and they've used that collateral and that clout and that power to kind of do what they want with Ukraine, because if we cut off Russia, we cut off their oil. Look what happens to the oil prices. Look what happens to our gas prices. Well, if we were using nuclear energy, all that would be taken care of. Why aren't we using it? We have the technology and the ability to use the nuclear energy, the fission and fusion, to create so much power to just, we can have one nuclear plant light up like whole regions of the country. To provide electricity and power for, and it's clean, it's efficient, it's cheap. Why aren't we doing it? Yeah.
Because it's unstable.
Because one mistake could be very bad, right? Have you ever heard of a city called Chernobyl? Anybody ever heard of that? Okay. And you know, again, relating to today, right there on the border of Ukraine and Russia, this city called Chernobyl that about, what year was that? 30 years ago. This awful accident at their nuclear power plant. That gets everybody like, oh no, can't do it. Still countries, a lot of countries in Europe are still relying on nuclear energy. We started to make the move to nuclear energy in spite of everybody going, no nukes, no nukes. Well, that was because we didn't want to use it to destroy people, but we don't even talk about nuclear energy anymore in America. You notice that? Who's talking about providing energy by using nuclear technology or atomic? Nobody. It's like we just totally threw it away because of that one accident. Because guess what? It could be great, clean, efficient, and cheap. But if you have that one accident, was it worth it? So Eisenhower's selling to the world, we can use this energy for peaceful means. That, light up cities. The domino theory. Anybody ever played dominoes? I don't mean played with dominoes, everybody's done that. Is there anybody that's never lined up dominoes and watched them all tumble one after the other? Who? No one. Everybody's done that, right? Has anybody ever actually played the game dominoes? Nice. Huh? Yeah. It's been like 30 years for me, so I would need to have like a couple refresher rounds to remember how to play. But it was a very popular game at one time. Why is Eisenhower using this phrase when he's talking about this very serious issue in the late 40s to the mid 50s called spread of communism? Why is he using that phrase domino theory? Yeah.
You set up dominoes.
Like what? So if
Line them up.
and if Korea falls to communism, then the next country falls to communism, then the next country falls to communism, where would that end? These dominoes just keep falling. What would that mean for America? What would that mean for free people all around the world? America being the beacon of freedom for all the rest of the world. What would happen if one by one, Thailand, Vietnam, Korea, all started going communist? And then that grows. It grows out of Southeast Asia and grows maybe, hey, what if it starts growing in Central America? What if they got control of like an island 90 miles south of Florida called Cuba? We want communism that close, the threat of that kind of dictatorship that we learned from World War II, and worse than when it comes to people dying because of a belief system. More people died or were killed, Derek, in Stalin's Russia than Hitler's Germany. Hitler's the face of evil for all times, maybe, when it comes to government, especially in the 20th century. More people died because of what Stalin was doing under the communist dictatorship in Russia. We want that anywhere near? Do we want anything to do with that? Absolutely not. So the fear of communism is dominating politics in America and throughout the world. And because of that, Americans are on high alert. You might say, what pun am I going to use? Instead of high alert, red alert, right? Because the Red Scare. So there is this committee we talked about, the House Committee, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. Why was the committee set up? Because most Americans feared the spread of communism. But something happens along the way. Oh, by the way, it's called McCarthyism because the guy's name was Joseph McCarthy. He was a senator who was picked to be the chairperson of this committee. He wasn't the only one that was on the committee, of course, but he was the chair. So everything's going to fall on him, right? He's the leader of the committee. So everything that was happening gets pointed to him. So this thing called McCarthyism becomes a very negative, a negative stain on American history. Because what happened was, because of this fear that most Americans had, the committee was formed to try to make sure nobody in government, nobody in education, nobody in entertainment would be influential and start to get people to believe that communism was the better way. So we got to make sure we root out all possible people that can influence others and try to tell them that communism is better than the capitalist free market system that America uses and the freedoms that we enjoy. It was a very serious thing. And it wasn't just Joseph McCarthy that thought so. It was Republicans and Democrats. It was most regular American families that thought communism was a vital, you know how they do polls before an election, like, hey, what's the most important issue? Education or defense or spread of communism was a very important issue for most Americans at this time, but something went wrong. And now something's going wrong. We're spinning again. The House Un-American Activities Committee. Come on. You know, this all started about a month ago. I had come in on a Saturday, and there was this guy, this technology guy that was working on the network or something. Mr. James was with him. I'm not kidding. I think ever since then I've had trouble with my internet because they were fixing it. Come on. What's the matter? What's the matter?
Derek blew a gasket.
Okay. You all right?
Yeah.
It starts with, I think he already started talking on here. Imagine one day you're brought before the government being charged with something that you have no idea even what they're talking about, but it's been insinuated that you're involved in something because he said or she said, and then they said that you were involved in it. So you have to be investigated and brought before these very powerful people being charged with something that many of the people were not guilty of at all.
Before a government panel, even though you haven't committed any crime or been formally charged with one, you are repeatedly questioned about your political views, accused of disloyalty, and asked to incriminate your friends and associates. If you don't cooperate, you risk jail or losing your job. This is exactly what happened in the United States in the 1950s as part of a campaign to expose suspected communists. Named after its most notorious practitioner, the phenomenon known as McCarthyism destroyed thousands of lives and careers. For over a decade, American political leaders trampled democratic freedoms in the name of protecting them. During the 1930s and 1940s, there had been an active but small communist party in the United States. Its record was mixed. While it played crucial roles in wider progressive struggles for labor and civil rights, it also supported the Soviet Union. From the start, the American Communist Party faced attacks from conservatives and business leaders, as well as from liberals who criticized its ties to the oppressive Soviet regime. During World War II, when the USA and USSR were allied against Hitler, some American communists actually spied for the Russians. When the Cold War escalated and this espionage became known, domestic communism came to be seen as a threat to national security. But the attempt to eliminate that threat soon turned into the longest lasting and most widespread episode of political repression in American history. Spurred on by a network of bureaucrats, politicians, journalists, and businessmen, the campaign wildly exaggerated the danger of communist subversion. The people behind it harassed anyone suspected of holding left of center political views or associating with those who did. If you hung modern art on your walls, had a multiracial social circle, or or signed petitions against nuclear weapons, you might just have been a communist. Starting in the late 1940s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover used the resources of his agency to hunt down such supposed communists and eliminate them from any position of influence within American society. And the narrow criteria that Hoover and his allies used to screen federal employees spread to the rest of the country. Soon, Hollywood studios, universities, car manufacturers, and thousands of other public and private employers were imposing the same political tests on the men and women who worked for them. Meanwhile, Congress conducted its own witch hunt, subpoenaing hundreds of people to testify before investigative bodies like the House Un-American Activities Committee. If they refused to cooperate, they could be jailed for contempt, or, more commonly, fired and blacklisted. Ambitious politicians like Richard Nixon and Joseph McCarthy used such hearings as a partisan weapon, accusing Democrats of being soft on communism and deliberately losing China to the communist bloc. McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, became notorious by flaunting ever-changing of alleged communists within the State Department. Egged on by other politicians, he continued to make outrageous accusations while distorting or fabricating evidence. Many citizens reviled McCarthy, while others praised him. And when the Korean War broke out, McCarthy seemed vindicated. Once he became chair of the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in 1953, McCarthy's recklessness increased. It was his investigation of the Army that finally turned public opinion against him and diminished his power. McCarthy's colleagues in the Senate censured him, and he died less than 3 years later, probably from alcoholism. McCarthyism ended as well. It had ruined hundreds, if not thousands of lives, and drastically narrowed the American political spectrum. Its damage to democratic institutions would be long-lasting. In all likelihood, there were both Democrats and Republicans who knew that the anti-communist purges were deeply unjust, but feared that directly opposing them would hurt their careers.
So what happened? In order to save democracy, what'd they do? Right. What's the foundation of democracy? What's the First Amendment? Hello, what's the First Amendment? You have a First Amendment right. What is it? Yeah. Go ahead, Caleb. Free speech, right? So the fear was so overwhelming about communism that it led people, and again, it's called McCarthyism because he was the chair. But as you know, the video, of course, all videos have bias. They went a little extreme, I think, on the one point saying if you had an art collection, whatever. But it is true that the sentiment in America was so strong against communism that we went against our own principles that we were supposedly trying to keep communism out because communism denies free speech, denies freedom of religion, censors anybody that goes against them. That's what's happening in Russia right now. And we were doing that to save freedom. Didn't make much sense, did it? We got to get done with these notes because I got up there. The quiz is Tuesday. So lights, please. The next big thing that happened in Eisenhower's first term was something called Brown versus Board of Education. And what that was the continuing saga of trying to make right what had been the history of our country when it comes to race that we thought we finally fixed in 1865 with the Civil War. But as you know, it continued to go on in the South because they refused to accept the defeat that of the Civil War, that blacks and whites are equal under the law. So we had continued discrimination. In fifth grade, if you weren't with us, we read a book called Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, based on the idea that 70 years after the Civil War, in southern states like Mississippi, blacks were still treated as second or even third class citizens just based on the color of their skin. And that book was about the audacity of one black family to actually own their own land and control their own destiny, even in 1930s. Well, now we're in the 1950s, and there's still strong evidence of people being discriminated against. And this case is about a girl that had a school 4 blocks from her house. Well, because there was this thing called segregation, segregate, separate, because there was this thing called segregation, the state of Kansas and their Board of Education said it's okay. Because based on previous Constitution decisions, there was this idea that it's okay to have black and white places as long as they're treated equally. Well, in fact, were they treated equally? If you can remember the book that we read together, which vaguely you might remember it, there was a black school and a white school, right? Which one was well kept? The white one, right? Which one had the bus take the kids to school? White, right? The black kids got to splash the water on them on the way to school. Remember that? So they were separate, but as long as legally you can show, hey, we're funding that school. Hey, we got qualified teachers at that school, like Mrs. Logan, then everything's fine. No, it wasn't. We know it wasn't, right? So this case finally put that to an end. This is a very big deal here because the Supreme Court said we cannot continue to think that this is okay to think like this. Separate but equal, we all know it's not. You can't make this girl, this third grade, I think she was, has a school just down the street, 4 blocks away, and we're going to make her walk here to get on a bus to take her to another school, like maybe miles from her house, just so that we make sure that she's going to a black school and not the white school. This wasn't happening in Ohio. This was happening, again, southern states. And this case, even though it was brought up in Kansas, because the Supreme Court ruled on it, that means no longer do we have this crazy idea that, oh, it's okay to have black schools and white schools, black water fountains and white water fountains. Come on. But the racist sentiments of the people in the South that couldn't let go of their right and their loss in the Civil War finally comes to an end. So this is it. These are the notes. Truman and Eisenhower, Quiz Tuesday. Got it? Not that much this time, right?
I was Chinese.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Oh, that is so cool.
I know that always happens. I know it was over here. Have you ever seen